Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's exactly 1 week out from the State of the Union address that President Trump will give to a joint session of Congress. Yes, it's just 1 week from now, happens to be the day after lawmakers return from their recess. And my question is, will he be addressing the room with part of the government still shut down, with Department of Homeland Security still not funded after midnight Friday came and went and no deal was made between Republicans and Democrats over ICE reforms?
You know, he was asked about it on Air Force One. He said, I think I would. Yeah, it wouldn't bother me. Wondering exactly how he would play that. Some think it's a bad look to be up there with one agency closed, but he could also use that as a hook to castigate Republicans or Democrats rather and blame them for not working with Republicans. So either way, we're going to be up there live, and this will likely be a doozy with a lot to talk about. We should mention that Democrats have come back with a counter offer to the counter proposal. We just don't know, Kailey, what's inside.
Yeah, we never got the details of what the White House countered with. Usually here in Washington, if people are quiet about the details, it may mean that actual progress is being made. But we know that the Democrats had a long list of demands that they initially put forward. And the question is going to be, how much will the Democratic base allow them to pull back on what they asked for and find some kind of compromise here? How much is the White House, on the other hand, willing to give in terms of compromise?
Well, let's check in with Tyler Kendall for the latest on this. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent joins us now live in our Washington bureau with her eyes as well on the meetings underway in Geneva. Let's start with DHS, Tyler. 4 days we knew we would start this week with this agency closed, and I think we know we're going to start next week with it closed as well. The big sticking points remain the same. Nothing has changed. Demasking and judicial warrants are non-starters on both sides of the aisle, it seems.
Right, exactly. We haven't really gotten much insight into how either side is going to ultimately need to compromise to reopen the Department of Homeland Security home to nearly 260,000 federal workers. But it almost feels eerily quiet here in Washington. I don't know if you guys feel that way, but Congress is on recess for at least the next week. So to your point, these are going to be negotiations that end up dragging on. Now, my inbox last night lit up late in the evening because we did hear from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who confirmed that Democrats have sent over their counter proposal. But to your point, we haven't really gotten momentum on what those non-starters essentially for Republicans are ultimately going to shake out to be, right? We know that the White House is in favor of body camera mandates, for example. We've already seen that put into place by DHS, but those other things like new warrant requirements and what's been called demasking, having federal agents remove their masks during immigration enforcement procedures, doesn't seem to be something on the table. And Joe and Kailey, this goes to Republicans' initial push that they really wanted to see this compromise be done through executive action, have President Trump put through some orders. But at the end of the day, Democrats are holding firm. They need to see some changes codified into law.
Yeah, they want to see legislation, though we know President Trump does not shy away from executive orders. In fact, it happens to be one of his favorite policy tools, if you will. President Trump, while focused on domestic issues like keeping all of the government agencies funded, also has had a great deal of focus on geopolitics, as we well know, in a variety of different theaters, Tyler. But the ones we're focused on today, because they both happen to be centered in conversations taking place in Geneva, Switzerland, are talks with Iran and over ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. This is how President Trump characterized it yesterday.
I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important. We'll see what can happen. It's been typically Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators, or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators. Well, they're big talks. It's going to be very easy. I mean, look, so far, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you.
So I'm not sure what we think about his indirect involvement, how direct that may be, Tyler. But knowing that Iran has said there is a general agreement here, and in 2 more weeks we should have further details of a potential deal, what do we really know?
So we have to take this into the broader context that essentially what we heard out of Iran today is that they're agreeing to more talks. The talks didn't go off the rails, which is seen as a relatively positive development when it comes to the diplomatic option being pursued. And it appears that the biggest question on the table right now is what is going to be the future of Iran's domestic enrichment capacity related to its nuclear program. That seems to be the number one crux of the talks at the moment. The thing thing is, we have repeatedly heard from U.S. officials, perhaps most notably the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who says that these talks need to expand beyond that. They want to see on the table Iran's ballistic missile program, also its support of regional proxy militia groups. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like they're going to end up broaching those topics. And in fact, our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics have said the fact that this has been limited to what they are calling the nuclear file, that's probably not going to be enough of a concession for the Trump administration. So they are still keeping in their assessment the likelihood that we could see military strikes down the road. And as you both know, we've seen escalation just in recent days, this bolstering of military assets, another carrier strike group going into the region, and Iran, of course, closing part of the Strait of Hormuz for pre-planned military drills.
So that's the first part of what he was talking about there with Iran. When you move to the talks also in Geneva with Witkoff and Kushner, another meeting that has now concluded here, he said, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you. Or what? It'll be occupied by Russia? Isn't that already happening? Pretty interesting statement from President Trump. Perhaps we thought he was upset with Putin most recently.
Perhaps goes to that mounting frustration that we have seen from the White House, that there hasn't been this breakthrough. Pretty remarkable just in and of itself that we're seeing these dual back-to-back negotiations in Geneva led by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I think it's fair to say that the consensus going into these talks was relatively low in terms of what sort of progress we would see, because we saw strikes just last night. The Ukrainian president posting in a social media post that there was nearly 400 drones and 29 missile attacks earlier today. Ukraine did confirm that it had targeted an energy infrastructure facility on the coast of the Black Sea. So we've really seen this escalation, sort of this pullback from what the White House had been touting as progress. We can say that in recent weeks there had been progress, in particular about security guarantees. That was one of the two biggest sticking points on the table. That appears to be relatively resolved. The U.S. has put forward really strong security guarantees, according to our reporting. But the issue of territory, and we heard from the Ukrainian President Zelensky earlier today, they're going to talk about this very important nuclear power plant in that eastern Donbass region. The issue of territory, it feels like we are just very far from any sort of agreement.
All right, Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, thank you so much. And on both of these conflicts and their potential resolutions or lack thereof, we turn now to Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, who's here with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Evelyn, it's good to speak with you again. If we could just begin with Iran, given that was the set of talks that happened first with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. This notion of there being a general agreement, an agreement to do another round of talks once we've exchanged some finer points of a potential deal here. How much should we be encouraged by that, knowing all the while en route to the Middle East right now is another carrier strike group?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would put too much stock in it, in the sense that when President Trump has two carriers off the coast or, within striking range of Iran, it usually means he's going to use force just based on past recent experience a la Venezuela. So I think that President Trump is pretty much leaning towards using force. The Iranians don't want him to use force. So of course they've agreed to some kind of framework. But I'm not sure that we should be encouraged that the end is in sight, because the Iranians were pretty dug in about limiting the agenda to nuclear, whereas we were pretty adamant that the missiles should also be included. And of course, it has immediate implications for the potential use of force. You can see the Iranians saying, well, if you're going to strike us, we want to have a capability to defend ourselves.
Is that why we need 2 more weeks? Evelyn, Axios reporting that is the word from Tehran. We will have detailed proposals in the next 2 weeks. What will they do at that time?
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly trying to make sure that the carrier, battle group can't be utilized or at least to try to put pressure on the White House not to use force before the 2 weeks are up. And we know that the second carrier will be in place at the end of this week. So President Trump is not going to want to wait 2 weeks. And so it does, again, it puts pressure on the White House. Now, what is the White House going to do? Because use of force is not something that's widely, popular inside the United States and certainly not inside of MAGA. And so if it's President Trump, if he's seen as preemptively using force when the Iranians seem to be willing to negotiate, that's a little bit of a political problem potentially for the White House.
Well, but it may not be as much of a problem if you're Israel or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was here in Washington meeting with President Trump on the issue of Iran last week. Evelyn, how much do you think Trump's decision-making will be influenced by what Netanyahu does or does not want when it comes to the ballistic missile program and other issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, because we know that, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been trying to, put pressure on President Trump to use force, I think. And then at the same time, the Gulf allies have been pressuring President Trump not to use force. I think President Trump is probably taking his own counsel. I'm not sure that he feels beholden to Israel in any way. I think he does want to bring about political change in Iran, and certainly he wants to eliminate the threat that's posed to Israel and others by Iran's nuclear and missile capability.
Let's turn to Ukraine for a moment, Evelyn. Are you encouraged by what you're hearing, or are you concerned that the president is turning on Volodymyr Zelensky once again?
Yeah, I mean, this is the same dynamic, Joe, over and over again we see, where President Trump is verbally pressuring Ukraine. Ukraine has already compromised with itself, in effect, through all the negotiations the White House has held, the meetings the White House has held with Ukraine to get them to a position, the most minimal position that they could accept. And at the same time, the White House has not put pressure on Russia. And of course, because of that, in part, Russia has not compromised. So it's time for the White House and the president to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. I think, once again, they will find that they have been disappointed by Russia at the negotiating table.
Pressure in what form? Evelyn, what would actually be effective in getting Putin to change his mind around a war that he has now been pursuing relentlessly for 4 years next week?
Right. The first step is putting, basically signing the sanctions legislation that I understand. I was in Munich at the security conference this past weekend with Senator Graham. He's feeling really good about his bill, the Graham-Blumenthal sanctions bill, being put on the floor of the Senate for a vote. We know that the House also would have to have a comparable bill. We know that there are the votes to get it passed, to get it on the desk of President Trump, and it's so high on the Senate side that the president can't veto it. So that would give him a real, card, if you will, that he can use against Putin to say, we're now sanctioning your oil and gas, and we're putting secondary sanctions. We're putting sanctions on those countries that buy your oil and gas, and that will hurt Putin because he's already having to draw down his foreign reserves in order to keep this war going. That's one. And then, of course, providing more assistance to Ukraine, more military assistance, getting more of those shadow tankers off the high seas. There are many things that we could be doing to put pressure on Russia.
I'm sure this is part of your discussions in Munich. Evelyn, just back from the Munich Security Conference, where the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was looming large this year following Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich last year that really rubbed our European allies the wrong way and kind of set the stage for some of the difficult conversations we've had with our European allies. John Micklethwaite, our editor-in-chief here at Bloomberg, sat down with Secretary Rubio to talk about his approach. Here's what he said.
The Vice President said last year very clearly was that Europe had made a series of decisions internally that were threatening to the alliance and ultimately to themselves, not because we hate Europe or we don't like Europeans, but because what is it that we fight for? What is it that binds us together? And ultimately, it's the fact that we are both heirs to the same civilization, and it's a great civilization, and it's one we should be proud of. It's one that's contributed extraordinarily to the world, and it's one, frankly, upon which America is built.
So do some reporting for us here in our remaining moment, Evelyn. What was the feel on the ground? Was Secretary Rubio looked at as the good cop to J.D. Vance's bad cop?
Largely speaking, Joe, yes. I think people did take a sigh of relief because the tone was markedly different. And he did say, we're going to be together. However, and that was kind of in the moment. However, subsequently, as you know, some of the coverage of what Europeans have said when they took a look at the transcript, when they looked at what Secretary Rubio said a little more closely, they questioned, what does this mean, civilization? And I think if you interpret it as a shared adherence to the rule of law, going back to Magna Carta and all of that, I think that the Europeans would feel good. If it means something more, akin to a kind of white colonial interpretation of our history, then people feel a little less reassured. But overall, I would say the feeling was
Evelyn
positive.
Farkas at the McCain Institute. Thank you. This is Bloomberg.
Stay with us on Balance of Power. We'll have much more coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
On this Mardi Gras 2026, it is not only Fat Tuesday, it is also a big day in the world of politics with the first votes being cast in this primary season. This is it, right? This is day one. Early voting begins in Texas. 10 days worth as we work our way to the primary on the 3rd of March. And, we've talked this up and down. This could be one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, and certainly the most dramatic Senate race in the country this season. And look, if you enjoy this kind of stuff, this is going to be high entertainment, in some cases for all the wrong reasons. But the fact is that we're going to be heading for a runoff, it looks like. Depending on what happens here with the primary itself, March 3rd again, the runoff would follow on May 26th if nobody clears 50%. And based on the polling we're seeing, that's probably not going to happen. So Cornyn, Paxton, Hunt, that's your three-way race. And this is going to be a doozy, unless, of course, President Trump gets involved and people keep asking if he's going to endorse in this race. And it sounds like, well, yeah, but he's going to endorse everyone. You've seen this before. Here's the president on Air Force One.
I just haven't made a decision in that race yet. It's got a ways to go, and I have. He's a good man. John is I like all three of them, actually. I like all three. Those are the toughest races. They've all supported me. They're all good, and you're supposed to pick one. So we'll see what happens.
They're all good. Can't go wrong. The John, of course, is John Cornyn. He's being asked, are you going to support the incumbent, Mr. President? The longtime senior senator from Texas? He says, well, I like them all. I like all three. So this is creating a bit of an issue here. Not that that's the only race in Texas, but this is the one that's going to take all of the attention, of course. Ken Paxton, of course, the Attorney General here last night announcing an illegal voting tip line for the primary, so it's on. As we assemble our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano is with us, our democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and Republican strategist Ashley Davis is back, partner at S3 Group, former special assistant to the Director of Homeland Security. It's going to be great to hear from both. We've got a great panel today. Great to see you both. Ashley, I want to start with you in Texas because I'm starting with the Republican primary today. Is Donald Trump going to pick one of these gentlemen? Because it looks like we're going to a runoff. Maybe he waits for May to start naming names. What do you think?
Joe, that's what I'm thinking. He probably waits and sees what happens, after March 3rd. Obviously, as you just said before we came on, that it's going to most likely go to a runoff. You have the polling showing that Paxton and Cornyn are within the margin of error, Paxton up 2, Cornyn up 2, depending on what poll you look at. But to me, which is really interesting, is Wesley Hunt's polling like 20%, which is super strong for him. I would think, though, it's going to happen after March 3rd is that Paxton probably doesn't make the runoff, and then you have Hunt doesn't make the runoff, and then you just have Paxton versus Cornyn, and that will be going into March 26th, and that will be a much clearer race. Lots of people that I talk to in Texas that are my former colleagues are, Cornyn's great. He's been around for a long time. They think Paxton's not great, and they like Wesley Hunt, but there's just absolutely no way to get him over the finish line at this point. So,
interesting.
I think Cornyn's strong.
In a statewide race, though, Ashley, Oh, that's Cornyn. Okay, interesting. Because, you play this statewide in Texas, and Paxton sounds a lot more like a MAGA candidate than John Cornyn, right? I mean, you still go advantage Cornyn in a two-way race.
I do, but here's why. I think people think that Paxton has a lot of baggage. And if you talk to any Democrat, they would much rather want to run against Paxton than Cornyn, obviously, for obvious reasons. But just like we would probably most likely run against Crockett. But I really think that people still look at Paxton's history and think of him as maybe not a really good person, even though he is more MAGA. But if it's a two-way race and then Cornyn performs pretty well, maybe that's when Trump does end up endorsing. I mean, I can't predict. No one can.
Sure. No, absolutely. It's going to be a heck of a Truth Social whenever that comes out. Jeannie, let's talk about the Democratic primary. And by the way, this Tallarico story on CBS is wild. This is the night before Netflix suddenly has to wait to hear Paramount with it. But let's just focus on what we're talking about here. Stephen Colbert booked James Tallarico, the Democratic candidate. He's a state lawmaker. We've had him on this program a couple of times, to join him in New York at the desk. Apparently, CBS told him he was not allowed to do that because of equal time laws at the FCC, which have been left on the side of the road years ago. But we'll acknowledge that. And so what they had to do, Jeannie, is just put it on YouTube. It didn't make the program. And as Colbert said, FCCU, Brendan Carr. But the fact is, you know how this works, Jeannie. That'll get way more views than something that was scheduled on CBS TV last night that may or may not have gone noticed. Now it's the banned interview, right? I can only imagine what'll happen to the clicks. And as I read here, in the Democratic primary, Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman, is leading with 47% of the vote, 39% Representative James Tallarico. How are you viewing this contest?
I'm smiling, Joe, because I'm so happy to talk about election season beginning. So thank you, and Ashley, very much. I'm very happy. It's been a doozy. This is one of the good things that has happened to Tallarico. CBS should ban interviews more often, I'm sure, as far as he's concerned. Certainly, this interview would not get nearly the looks that it will now that it's been, quote unquote, banned. And of course, this has been a really tough and personal race. You guys were just talking about on the Republican side. But on the Democratic side, you've had charges online of racist statements made by Tallarico. He says they weren't made. You had a former candidate in Colin Allred endorsing Crockett. You've had a lot of concern amongst moderate Democrats that if Crockett wins, she can't win. But I think, just like when Ashley was talking about the Republican side, where it's sort of this, moderate center of the road versus MAGA, in the Democratic side, there can be surprises because, Crockett, for all of the challenges people say that she has, she is running and saying, I can bring out the vote. I can increase voter turnout amongst the base. She's like the Donald Trump of the campaign versus Tallarico, who's saying, I will reach to the middle. I'll pull those independents and those moderates, and maybe Democrats will, for once in a century or something, win Texas. It's all a very uphill battle for the Democrats, but it really depends, on who wins on the Democratic side and who wins on the Republican, because, of course, Crockett versus somebody like Paxton is far better for the Democrats' traditional thinking goes than it is going to be Tallarico versus somebody like a Paxton.
Who's a better candidate statewide in the primary? Is it Tallarico?
In the general, that's the traditional thinking. But, Joe, I'm so over traditional thinking at this point because every time we go there, it seems to blow up in its face. And I think you cannot deny what a really accomplished politician Crockett is. But again, a lot of that depends on, can she get people out to vote and who can she run against? And of course, Tallarico comes with his own baggage. Now he's got a little support from Colbert and the CBS. So that's a good thing for him.
I guess so. He had Joe Rogan on his side a couple months ago. We'll see if that remains the case as we spend time with our panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Ashley Davis, the beginning of early voting. I'm psyched for campaign season as well, you two. Just spend too much time here in the bubble. But we have to talk about a major story that a lot of people woke up to this morning, and that is the passing of Jesse Jackson, 84 years old, surrounded by his family. Of course, a prominent civil rights leader and somebody who ran for president a couple of times, remembering this DNC speech in 1984.
I'm more convinced than ever that we can win. We have fought up the rough side of the mountain. We can win. I just want young America to do me one favor. Just one favor. Exercise the right to dream. You must face reality, that which is, but then dream of the reality that ought to be, that must be.
Some 2 decades, even more, before America elected its first black president. Jeannie, what are your thoughts on not just the legacy? You're going to hear a lot about that today. I don't even know what that means all the time when we talk about politicians, but the impact that he had on the Democratic base was what?
Enormous. I mean, I think in the later part of the 20th century, there's nobody on the Democratic side who had was a bigger force. He changed. You heard the beautiful oratory there. He ran for president twice. He was a civil rights icon working with Martin Luther King. He worked overseas. But what he did in terms of impacting Black public officials running for office and seeing themselves as people capable of running for office, so many of them say today that they were told as children to repeat the phrase that he made famous, I am somebody. And that was what helped them catapult into elected office or into leadership writ large. And he was not just a great orator, he was a great political mind. Without him changing the way that we manage and count delegates on the Democratic side and proportional representation, there would be no Barack Obama. So in all ways and every ways, he changed things. He wasn't perfect, but his impact is enormous, including 2 sons who have either been in or are running for Congress. That's quite a legacy.
Yep, that's right. And Jonathan Jackson is still reporting for work on Capitol Hill. Ashley, he, of course, was a Democrat. There's no doubt there. But Jesse Jackson impacted politicians around the political spectrum as a black man in this country, running for president, mounting a serious campaign before that was considered mainstream.
Absolutely. And I also think, Joe, one of the things that Jeannie was talking about what he did for Black individuals and public leaders across the country, but also remember in 84 and 88 when he ran, he also went and was able to bring in the poor white people as well. I mean, there's an iconic picture of him in Iowa with sitting on a tractor with a bunch of white farmers around him. But I think that something, and people have kind of been talking about this today as well, is kind of that economic populist message that actually, ironically, Trump taps into as well. But he did that. He was the first to do that, and he was a brilliant communicator. He was somebody that was able to really utilize, obviously, his gift of being able to message, but also the media. If you think about 84, 88, and, there forward, up until maybe Barack Obama, JFK, maybe early, a little earlier, they were not, he was able to get the populist message across differently than anybody else.
Really interesting, and appreciate both of your thoughts on that. Ashley Davis and Jeannie Shanzano.
Stay with us on Balance of Power. We'll have much more coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we want to keep the focus on the markets for a minute longer because it surely has been a very volatile ride over the last few weeks. And it seems that the start of this trading week is no different. We were down, now we're up or flat. That could very well change in the next couple minutes as we have this conversation with Christina Kino. She's managing editor for the Bloomberg Markets Live blog and is joining us now from New York. So, Christine, obviously there's been a good deal of whiplash. A lot of it seems to be centered around the AI narrative specifically. Have we figured out yet if this is going to be the best thing ever, that leads to all of these advances, or potentially a worse thing that makes even the white collar folks lose their job and makes some of these publicly traded companies obsolete?
Well, Kailey, if we knew the answer to that, then we wouldn't be here, would we? But sadly, unfortunately, I mean, the jury is still very much out in terms of the impact of AI and how much it could disrupt certain industries, and which industries even for that matter. I think what the price action is telling us today, of course, is that this is no longer a one-way bet in terms of risk sentiment. Last week, it was very much a risk-off sort of environment. Tech, of course, leading the sell-off there. But at this point, we have seen about a 10% drawdown in infotech stocks on the S&P 500. And for a lot of buyers, that's actually pretty attractive levels to buy back in, because at the end of the day, I mean, the tech sector, in a way, can function as a haven, given that a lot of these companies have very, very large cash coffers. They still have a lot of ability to spend. And so, you know, when you're looking for a relative haven, especially within the equity markets, you'd probably want to turn into some of these biggest companies as a way of protecting your money, as opposed to some of the more sensitive companies to, say, fluctuations in growth and consumer sentiment.
You know, I heard the word SaaSpocalypse so many times over the weekend, Christine, that I thought maybe this thing is over. But then I look down at Salesforce and Microsoft and the rest, and I see that software is still out of fashion. Everybody's trying to figure out if Anthropic and Claude are going to replace, I guess, my Windows machine. But I'm also curious about cyber. We've talked about this before, and we have earnings after the bell from Palo Alto. Could this be an inflection point where, depending on what is said in this call, cyber is siloed off from the rest of application software?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a big question, especially for companies such as Palo Alto, Joe, right? Because, on the one hand, I mean, the complex, it's changing now. It's really not just kind of a monolithic trade, the AI trade, right? It is turning into winners and losers. And obviously, the SaaSpocalypse talk of last week very much focusing in on some of the weaker spots of the AI complex. And so when you talk about cyber, of course, I mean, they, of course, have something different to offer that is difficult for some AI to replicate, but not entirely, right? And so it really is a question of to what extent companies like Palo Alto and the services that they provide are seen as valuable enough for investors to pay up the premium versus something that maybe could be done by AI, maybe not now, but perhaps in a few years.
You could just tell that Christine reads analyst notes all morning for breakfast.
I love it. It's my favorite thing.
And, I bet that's true. It's great to see you, Christine Aquino, as the NASDAQ turns positive again, up about 1/3% or 84 points. Palo Alto, for what it's worth, just because we mentioned that, still trending lower. It's down about 1.5% ahead of earnings, and CrowdStrike is lower for that matter. So we'll keep tabs on that with an important conversation, Kailey, after the bell on the late edition of Balance of Power with the CEO of Palo Alto, Ed Ludlow, will bring us that conversation, and we're looking forward to it. On what is day 4, if you haven't been reminded, it's certainly not on the front page in any major American newspaper, day 4 of a partial government shutdown. Realizing, of course, that ICE is getting money from the big, beautiful bill. This in a couple of weeks or even less, once we get into March, could become a much more urgent feeling issue with FEMA, the TSA, the Coast Guard, all set to go without pay. And it's where we start our conversation with Congresswoman Dina Titus, the Democrat from Nevada's 1st District. Yes, our eyes are on Las Vegas. And it's great to see you once again, Congresswoman, here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Lawmakers are gone for the rest of this week. I know that members of the House and Senate will be back next. But there doesn't seem to be a path for a breakthrough on a deal here when it comes to demasking or warrantless raids. Unless you're hearing something differently, Congresswoman, what's going to happen here? How long could this last?
Well, I'm not. I understand maybe we've offered something else to the Republicans, but the Senate's gone. I mean, they're in Munich at the conference, or some of them are at the Olympics. They need to get back here and make some plans. You know, the shutdown really hurts Nevada. If you don't have TSA, where our tourism is already negatively impacted by this administration, and this will just hurt more. And there's such an easy solution. Pull those out. Pull out FEMA, pull out TSA, pull out Coast Guard, fund them and send them on their way, and then deal with the safeguards that we can put in place with with ICE. You know, we can't cut off their money because they got all that money back in the big, beautiful bill. So they're funded. They can do whatever they want. They've got the 16th largest military budget in the world, but we could put those guardrails in place.
Well, so what guardrails at the end of this, Congresswoman, do you expect will be put into place? Is the White House actually more flexible, and Republicans more flexible than they're suggesting publicly at this time? Are you hearing that from your leadership?
Well, you would hope so. I can't speak for the White House. I never know what they're going to do. But the Republicans are saying no to mask. Now, Matt, our police officers, our law enforcement, they don't wear masks. They wear name tags. You know who they are. They have to have help to go into a place. They don't just do these broad raids like ICE does. There are certain rules of how they operate. We're not asking any more of them than we ask of our regular law enforcement. And I don't know what the problem is of why they can't agree to that.
I know you're on the Transportation Committee in the House, Congresswoman. TSA is going to start missing paychecks, if I'm correct, the first week of March. Okay. Are there going to be any accommodations made for these workers, or are they going to start having some tough memories from the last shutdown?
Well, the last one, remember, was a record 40-something days. Here at Caron Airport. We had food banks set up. I helped them get gas cards from the convention center so they could get back and forth to work. Private sector helped to make donations. So they were depending on the goodness of people's hearts because they weren't getting those paychecks from the federal government. Now, they got them after the fact, but that doesn't help you pay the rent as you go along. Mm-hmm. So, morale is already low at TSA. They have to put up with a lot of grief from dissatisfied customers coming through who don't want to open up their suitcases. And now you're asking them to do it and keep us all safe while not even giving them the respect of a paycheck.
Well, so how long should they be expected to go without a paycheck? We know, as we were alluding to the record shutdown, that was more than 40 days at the tail end of last year, Congresswoman. Should we expect that this could take longer than that if masks and other issues remain so firmly stuck with your side wanting one thing and the White House and Republicans wanting the other? Could this last longer than that, given that it is only one agency shut down and the pain is felt in a relatively small group of people?
Well, it shouldn't matter. This shouldn't last any longer than any one day. Now, hopefully we could get something done before this kicks in the 1st of March so they don't have to go without a paycheck. But if the Republicans refused any of these crackdowns on the way ICE is operating, it's going to be hard to come to a deal. Now, last time with the health care and with the short-term CR, some Democrats who said they were going to stand firm peeled off and voted with the Republicans for some kind of accommodation. If they do that, the only accommodation I can imagine is another CR, maybe to the end of the fiscal year. This time it was 2 weeks, and nobody thought they could get it solved in 2 weeks. But one thing that's really important to remember is the public is with the Democrats on this. All the polling shows that the public thinks that these ICE characters should follow the same rules as regular law enforcement. That's all that we're asking. And the public agrees with that. They've seen the pictures of Minneapolis. They've said this is too much. This is not what we expected from an agency that was supposed to just be going after the bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman, I talked to your friend Derek Stevens a couple weeks ago before the Super Bowl. We talked about your Fair Bet Act, and we also got into the role that prediction markets have been playing and not playing, depending on how you look at this in the gambling business. You've got something called the Fair Markets and Sports Integrity Act to stop prediction markets from skirting state gaming laws, which is a big deal for a guy like Derek Stevens, because he runs Circa and a couple of other, he owns and runs these casino resorts in Las Vegas. I want you to listen to what he said and get your reaction.
They're not paying any state income tax. They're not paying anything into problem gambling. They're not paying a federal excise tax. You know, I realize there's a little bit of a surge of, let's support prediction markets, but I don't think that's necessarily the right long-term path here. I mean, think about it this way. If someone hijacked a truck that had nothing but big screen televisions and brought that truck into the parking lot of a Best Buy and was able to sell these TVs at half price, would we really be supporting these marauders the way it seems like it is? I don't think so. And I think prediction markets have a great spot in America, in our economy, in our ecosystem. But what they're doing with sports betting, it's a little bit crazy.
He calls them marauders, Congresswoman. Do you have support for that bill in Washington? Will you bring Derek Stevens here to testify?
Well, Derek has been a great friend and an ally on my bill to allow 100% deduction from your losses for your income taxes out of that phantom money. So he has been a friend, and I agree with him on these prediction markets. You know, for the last decade, state by state, tribe by tribe, have put in place regulations for sports betting. And some places have said, no, we don't want any sports betting in our state. Now to just throw that out and totally ignore it by Kailey and Polymarket because they want to do this without any of those guardrails, I don't think is right. Now, I have the bill, as you mentioned, that would stop that. I'm not saying do away with those. If they want to do innovation and they want to offer which bet on which bird flew off the wire, or Jesus is coming back, or what's Swifty going to wear, that's all fine. But when you move into the sports betting market, then you have got to follow the rules. So if you want to offer sports bets, fine, but just follow the rules of the states where they're already established.
Well, Congresswoman, you refer to the state's rules here, and the new chair of the CFTC, Mike Selig, suggested today that this should be the CFTC's purview, prediction markets. They should oversee it at the federal level, not do it state by state. What's your response to that?
Well, we've never had federal regulation of gaming. It's always been left to the states. And this agency is set up to oversee commodities markets. That's usually pork bellies and corn, things like that. And they do a good job of that. But they are not equipped to regulate gaming. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the resources to do it. Now, let's also remember that there's some inside a little collaboration here, I guess might be the word for it, because you've got the president's son sitting on the board of the two biggest prediction market companies, Kailey and Polymarket. And this person has been appointed, who's now kind of in his argument to the courts, not mentioning sports betting, but mentioning innovation and opportunity. Yeah. He also fails to mention the things that Derek Stevens mentioned: no taxes, no protection for the gamer, no programs for problem gamers.
We have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us, Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.